welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for an intensive look at what happens inside the mind of the military leader. We're focusing really on the intense cognitive challenges that are just inherent in the art of command.
Right.
This isn't about, bullets and maneuvers. It's about processing the unprocessable and making decisions when uncertainty is pretty much the only constant.
That's exactly right. And this deep dive, it's really centered on a core conceptual process known as commander's visualization, basically the mental blueprint that leaders create to direct their forces.
Okay, so where are we pulling this from? What are the sources today?
To explore this, we've gone to some foundational material, primarily the Army Doctrine Publication 6.0, Mission Command and Control of Army Forces.
Your core doctrine.
Core doctrine, yeah.
Yeah.
And we're using that as a filter, really, to analyze the psychological challenges detailed in a fantastic article called What Were You Thinking? By Ted Thomas and Robert Riley.
I remember that one.
And we'll also be weaving in some rich biographical accounts from the Korean War to see how these principles, or lack thereof, play out in the real world.
So our mission today, then, is to first really understand this whole structure of command and visualization. How does a leader move from just raw information to an actionable purpose?
Right.
And then we're going to pivot pretty sharply and dissect the cognitive and psychological roadblocks, the systematic biases that can absolutely derail even the most experienced commanders.
And the doctrine itself gives us the perfect hook for this, because it says right up front that command is an art, not a science.
I love that framing. The Army Doctrine Publication 6.0 doesn't even try to pretend that military operations are neat and tidy.
No, not at all. They're human endeavors. It's a continuous contest of wills, and it's all happening in these environments that are dynamic, ambiguous, and just inherently uncertain.
So it accepts that because of friction, because of unexpected events, the fog of war, you just can't achieve perfect order.
The goal isn't to eliminate uncertainty. That's impossible. The goal is to manage it. And command is more art than science because it relies so heavily on timely judgment, on intuition, and the ability to inspire action.
Things that only a human can do.
Exactly. Things only human beings can perform. A computer can calculate a ballistic trajectory, but only a commander can apply judgment to accept risk.
So if the art of command is this creative and skillful exercise of authority through timely decision-making, where does a commander even start when they're faced with all that chaos? What's the framework they use to impose some measure of control?
Well, the doctrinal answer is what's called the operations process. This is the big framework they use for exercising command and control.
Okay.
It consists of 4 major activities that are always happening at the same time: planning, preparing, executing, and continuously assessing. It's a cycle.
A perpetual cycle, so the force is always learning and adapting.
It has to be. And crucially, the commander is the one who drives this whole cycle. They don't just watch it happen, they kick it off and they guide it.
How do they do that?
Through 6 essential integrated activities, as the doctrine lays them out: understand, visualize, describe, direct, lead, and assess.
Okay, so if you look at those 6, the real conceptual heavy lifting, the mental work that sets the whole operation in motion, that happens right at the beginning in the first 2. Understanding and visualizing.
That's where it all starts.
Let's focus on that first one then, achieving understanding. Because in a world of information overload, it seems so important to distinguish between having data, having information, and actually achieving true operational understanding.
It is the bedrock. That distinction is the bedrock of good decision-making.
So if you get that part wrong,
If you shortchange this step, everything that follows, the visualization, describing your intent, directing action, it's all going to be fundamentally flawed. The doctrine explains this through a 4-level hierarchy that shows how we move from, raw noise to strategic clarity.
okay, let's unpack these 4 levels. Let's start at the bottom with the easiest thing to collect: data. What does that look like in a military context, and why isn't it enough?
Data is just. It's unprocessed observations. It's the raw input detected by a soldier, a sensor, an electronic collector. Think of it like a constant stream of facts and figures.
Enemy vehicle at grid coordinate X.
Exactly. Weather's 34 degrees, fuel is at 60%. It's quantifiable, you can stick it in a database, but in that raw state, it has no meaning. It tells you nothing about the enemy's intent or whether we're succeeding.
So that raw data stream needs context. The next step up is processing it into information. What's the change there?
Information is data that's been organized and processed to provide that context for analysis. This is where the staff starts to earn their keep.
Right.
They're answering basic questions like, What are the trends? What type of vehicle was it? What's our rate of fuel consumption? It's structured data that starts to reveal patterns.
But the sheer amount of information available today is just staggering.
And that can lead to analysis paralysis if you don't keep moving up the chain.
I see this constantly in the business world. People confuse having a massive spreadsheet full of metrics with actually knowing what to do next. Information tells you what is happening, but not why or what to do about it.
And that moves us to the third level. Knowledge.
The crucial bridge.
It is the bridge. Knowledge is information that has been analyzed and evaluated for its operational implications. This is where the commander's personal background, their education, their professional experience all come into play.
So the staff is analyzing the information.
And they're assessing its relevance based on comprehension they've gained through study and practice. For instance, the data is a vehicle at grid X. The information is that it's an armored personnel carrier moving east.
Okay.
The knowledge is understanding that an armored personnel carrier moving east on that road network at this time of day. Well, that suggests the enemy is repositioning forces for a counterattack based on their historical patterns.
So knowledge is basically informed judgment and comprehension. It's what lets you start predicting what the other side is trying to do. And then finally, at the top of this whole thing, the state you need for action is understanding.
Understanding is the synthesis. It's knowledge combined with the commander's judgment to fully comprehend the situation's interrelationships.
The interdependencies.
The interdependencies between the enemy, friendly forces, the terrain, the time available. It enables decision-making and it drives action. If knowledge is understanding, the enemy is likely repositioning. Understanding is knowing why they're doing it, what impact that has on our plan, and what the consequences will be if we don't act in the next 2 hours.
That progression is so powerful because it really hammers home that commanders have to make decisions based on understanding, not just raw data. And the doctrine is careful to note that you have to accept that perfect understanding is, well, rarely possible.
It's the ultimate paradox of command, isn't it? You have to strive for complete understanding, but you'll never achieve it because of uncertainty and time.
If you wait for all the data points to align.
You'll miss your window of opportunity completely. The ability to make that leap from knowledge, which is factual, to understanding, which requires intuition and synthesis, that is the defining feature of great command.
And I think that leap is what brings us directly to the second great task of the commander, visualization.
Exactly. Once the commander has achieved that situational understanding as complete as possible in the time they have, they move into the core conceptual phase. Commander's visualization.
I really want to highlight the doctrinal definition here because it paints such a picture of the cognitive scope required. It's the mental process of developing situational understanding, determining a desired end state, and envisioning an operational approach by which the force will achieve that end state. That's a mental blueprint.
It is. It's the cognitive process that links the current reality to the future goal. And the doctrine breaks this visualization down into 3 essential components, which have to align perfectly in the commander's mind.
And these 3 components, they basically answer the most fundamental strategic questions, right? Where are we? Where are we going? And how do we get there?
That's it. First, the commander has to lock in the current situation, which is informed by all that understanding we just talked about. This isn't just where the enemy is, it's terrain, weather, logistics, morale, a precise, objective assessment of reality right now.
Then you jump to the future, the end state.
The end state is described by the desired future conditions that define what success looks like. It has to be clear, measurable, and achievable. If you visualize an end state that's impossible or irrelevant, the whole operation is pointless. It's the compass bearing for the entire force.
And the third component, the actual bridge between the two, is the operational approach.
And that's the conceptualization of the broad mission, the necessary tasks, the big actions required to move the force from this current messy state to that clear, successful end state. It's conceptual, it defines the what and the where, but it leaves the how to subordinates.
So the commander is doing this massive amount of mental work to create this picture. But as we said, a perfect visualization is meaningless if it stays locked inside the commander's head. The next critical task is actually describing that visualization.
Describing is the point where that mental art becomes physical action across the force. The commander describes their visualization to their staff and subordinates to make sure they all achieve a shared understanding and purpose.
And this is usually communicated through the commander's intent and mission orders.
Precisely. And this is where the doctrine really champions decentralized decision-making. The description focuses overwhelmingly on the purpose, the why, rather than the tiny details of execution, the how.
That's the genius of it.
It is. If the mission order is just a detailed sequence of tasks, the moment the first thing goes wrong, the whole force just stops and waits for a new order.
Right, they're paralyzed.
But if the commander's intent is communicated clearly, so that subordinates 2 levels down understand the ultimate purpose and the desired end state, they can exercise what's called disciplined initiative.
They can adapt on the fly, take unexpected risks, and still be acting completely in line with what the boss wants.
And it ensures unity of effort, even in total chaos.
That makes perfect sense. Clarity of intent is the lubricant of decentralized action. But achieving this shared vision requires constant judgment, especially when you're managing all the inherent risks. This is where the art really separates the capable commander from the reckless one.
And judgment, as the doctrine explains, is built from knowledge, education, a lot of experience, and intuition. It's the ability to pick the critical time and place to act, and it's most critically applied in identifying, mitigating, and accepting risk.
Okay, let's spend some real time on the distinction the doctrine makes between accepting risk and just plain gambling. We hear risk takers thrown around all the time, but in military command, that difference can be catastrophic.
It is a life-or-death distinction. Accepting risk is a necessary, analyzed part of every successful operation. A commander uses their understanding and judgment to identify hazards, analyze potential harm, minimize as many of them as they can, and then consciously accept the residual risk against the perceived benefit.
So they know the potential costs, but they move forward anyway
Right.
because the opportunity outweighs that cost. It's a calculated move.
Precisely. You analyze the problem, you wargame the most dangerous course of action, you set up mitigation strategies, reserves, counterfire, and then you accept that calculated risk to seize the opportunity. Audacity requires accepting risk.
But commanders should actively avoid gambling. What defines that threshold? Where do you cross the line?
Gambling is making a decision where the commander risks the force without a reasonable level of information about the outcome. It's recklessness. It suggests a failure to achieve that necessary level of understanding, or just a failure to apply sound judgment. If you can't assess the potential risk because you haven't done the analysis, or if you're just ignoring available information, you are gambling.
Commanders must be audacious.
But they cannot be reckless.
And that recklessness, that failure of judgment, it often isn't caused by a lack of intelligence, but by inherent psychological blind spots. Which leads us perfectly into our next section where we confront the human element.
Yes, because now that we understand this process of moving from raw data to a visualized plan, we have to confront the reality that the commander, no matter how smart or well-trained, is still susceptible to predictable irrationality. This is where the doctrine meets the psychological analysis of Thomas and Riley.
So in the decision-making phase, the doctrine outlines 2 primary approaches, analytic and intuitive. I suspect that the time pressure of combat often forces the commander out of the analytic and into the intuitive one.
That's the constant tension. The analytic decision-making approach is the methodical, deliberate process. You generate multiple courses of action, you compare them systematically against criteria, risk, time, resources, and you select the optimal solution.
The formal military decision-making process is a perfect example of this.
It is. It's best used during deliberate planning, when you have time for all that analysis and wargaming.
It's the ideal method. But when the bullets are flying and your timeline is in minutes, you have to switch modes entirely. That's the intuitive decision-making approach.
Intuition is necessary during execution. It depends entirely on experience. The commander relies on rapid pattern recognition, recognizing key signals that tell them what's happening and quickly identifying an acceptable course of action.
Maybe not the optimal one, but fast and good enough.
Fast and good enough. It focuses on the bigger picture and relies heavily on the quality of the commander's past experience.
And it is precisely when we rely on that rapid intuition on pattern recognition and gut feeling that cognitive traps become the most dangerous, because they exploit the shortcuts our brain takes to process things quickly.
Thomas and Riley describe these cognitive biases not as logical fallacies, which are errors in an argument, but as systematic errors in thought processing itself. They're often rooted in memory, attention, motivation.
And they become invisible to us.
They're invisible because they are hardwired into how we make sense of the world.
Let's use the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 as the perfect historical example. I mean, this was an administration filled with some of the most intelligent, accomplished people in the country, yet they made a series of profoundly poor decisions. Why?
It was a perfect storm of biases, all operating at the same time. The failure wasn't due to stupidity. It was due to structured, predictable irrationality. Let's start with the most powerful one, the anchoring trap.
The idea that we give way too much weight to the first piece of information we hear, and everything else gets unconsciously compared to that anchor.
Absolutely. President Kennedy was sworn in January 1961. 2 days later, he gets his first briefing on the Cuba Plan from Richard Bissell, the Central Intelligence Agency planner. Bissell had spent months developing this complex, large-scale beach assault plan. This highly persuasive initial briefing immediately anchored Kennedy and his team to this single military option.
So the die was cast before they even had a chance to consider other ideas. The sheer weight of that initial comprehensive plan made it impossible for them to seriously consider alternatives later, like diplomacy or small-scale sabotage or just walking away.
The beach assault was the first and only model on the table, and that anchor was immediately reinforced by the confirming evidence trap. Once you've got a decision you like, you unconsciously seek out information that confirms it, and you ignore or discount anything that contradicts it.
And in the Bay of Pigs case, the administration desperately wanted to maintain plausible deniability. They needed the world to believe the U.S. military wasn't involved.
But the reality was the plan was anything but covert. There were tons of leaks in major newspapers about the secret training camps in Guatemala, about recruitment efforts, the objectives. Yet the administration systematically ignored this overwhelming public evidence because it contradicted their desired outcome of plausible deniability.
They just focused on what they wanted to believe.
They focused only on the narrow, self-serving fact that no U.S. combat troops were physically designated for the landing. They confirmed their own narrative, despite all the noise.
That leads directly to the third trap, which is maybe the hardest one for any leader to overcome personally. The sunk cost trap.
The sunk cost trap is that commitment to a bad decision based purely on the emotional energy, time, and resources you've already invested in it. By the time Kennedy took office and was anchored to the plan, vast resources had already been committed. Money, facilities, people.
The emotional cost of admitting that initial investment was a mistake was just too high.
It's the classic throwing good money after bad. Bissell, who had staked his entire professional reputation on this plan, was probably the most susceptible. The operation just started moving forward with this internal, self-sustaining momentum that had nothing to do with whether it was a good idea anymore.
And this momentum was encouraged by the framing trap. This is the bias that shows how the way a problem is presented to you influences your appetite for risk.
Exactly. The framing determines whether you're going to be a risk seeker or risk averse.
So how was the Bay of Pigs issue framed for Kennedy?
The CIA framed it in terms of the danger of having a Soviet satellite 90 miles off the Florida coast. The decision was focused on the potential gain U.S. national security, the prestige of democracy, removing a communist threat. When decisions are framed in terms of potential gains, people are naturally risk-seeking. They'll take a bigger gamble to get a positive outcome.
Wow, I see the implications instantly. If they had framed it by the consequences of failure, the potential loss of international credibility, the political humiliation, a closer Cuba-Soviet alliance, they would have been much more risk-averse.
Much more cautious. It probably would have been a different decision. The framing skewed their risk calculus toward aggression. The fifth bias at play was the status quo trap. This is our inherent human aversion to change. We prefer the current state of affairs over something new or difficult.
And since the invasion planning was already well underway when Kennedy took office, stopping it would have been a huge political and bureaucratic lift.
Immensely difficult. It would have meant admitting his predecessor was wrong, firing people, absorbing political heat for being weak. Rather than doing all that painful, difficult work, the administration defaulted to sticking with the plan they inherited. Maintaining the status quo, even a flawed one, felt safer.
And finally, the last nail in the coffin was the overconfidence trap. I mean, this was a famously brilliant, young, successful team. Did they really believe they couldn't fail?
They exhibited classic overconfidence, which led to this assumption of low vulnerability. They were optimistic to the point of arrogance, believing that democracy and the U.S. cause would somehow be vindicated just by being morally right. They prevented them from subjecting the plan to the rigorous, skeptical questioning it so desperately needed.
Their combined brilliance just reinforced their collective blind spots.
It's fascinating how intertwined they all are. Overconfidence starts with anchoring. Confirming evidence is sought to validate a sunk cost decision. It just shows that effective command isn't just about absorbing doctrine. It's about actively battling your own brain's natural tendencies.
So since these traps are just part of the human condition, we can't just wish them away. The key has to be mitigation.
Exactly. The best leaders, military or civilian, they understand they are biased, and they implement structured techniques to counteract those errors.
So if we look at those specific biases, what can a commander do at the individual level to fight them? Let's start with the one that starts all the damage, the powerful anchoring trap.
To counter anchoring, the leader has to have structured self-discipline. Crucially, they have to avoid speaking too early in planning sessions. If the commander voices their preferred solution first, they immediately anchor every single subordinate to that idea.
And it just kills independent creative thought.
It does. The commander has to think independently first, formulate their initial visualization in private, and then seek out diverse opinions from their staff before they give any initial guidance. Structured silence is a powerful tool here.
And for the insidious sunk cost trap, how do you convince a leader to admit a past investment was a mistake?
This requires an outside perspective. The leader needs to find uninvolved parties, people or teams who have no emotional investment, no political career stake, no time sunk into the project, to critique the decision without any prejudice.
And internally?
Internally, the leader has to create a command climate where tolerable failure is accepted and experimentation is encouraged. If your people know they can fail forward without it ending their career, they're far more likely to raise the red flag when a plan is going off the rails.
That makes the cost of admitting failure lower than the cost of continuing the disaster.
Okay, and to fight the overconfidence trap, the idea that our brilliance guarantees success.
For that, we turn to structured planning tools, the pre-mortem and the post-mortem. A pre-mortem is an exercise you do before you execute. You ask the team to imagine that the plan has catastrophically failed 6 months in the future.
And then they work backward to figure out why. They work backward to determine the causes. This forces the team to challenge the underlying assumptions and address vulnerabilities when the stakes are still just intellectual. And a post-mortem is the learning tool after an actual failure, an impartial analysis of what really happened to learn from it, not just to assign blame.
But combating these traps, especially groupthink, isn't just about what the individual commander does. It's a team sport. It requires organizational techniques and the right command climate.
Absolutely. The collaborative techniques are designed to structurally introduce dissent and challenge. The first and most important is the formal implementation of red teaming.
And red teaming is more than just assigning someone to play devil's advocate, a role that's often doomed to fail.
Right, because everyone expects them to lose the argument. A dedicated red team establishes a structure to look at the entire problem from the adversary's perspective. They think like the enemy, they identify vulnerabilities in your plan, they challenge every single assumption, and they model the most dangerous courses of action.
It systematically introduces the element of surprise.
And directly counters the anchoring, status quo, and overconfidence traps. Another structural defense against bias is simply diversity of thought, experience, and background.
If everyone in the room has the same background, they're going to share the same blind spots.
Of course, varied viewpoints from different echelons, different military specialties, different cultures, they increase creativity, innovation, and resistance to groupthink. Diversity breaks the homogeneity that feeds the status quo trap.
But for red teaming and diversity to actually work, the leader has to foster a climate of genuine questioning. If a junior staff member is afraid to speak up, the entire mitigation effort is pointless.
And that's where the humility of the commander becomes the deciding factor. The climate has to encourage and genuinely value questions, forcing people to challenge facts, assumptions, and the current mental model. This requires the commander to accept the possibility that they are wrong.
Which brings us back full circle to the foundation of mission command in the doctrine, establishing a safe-to-fail climate.
If the commander wants subordinates to exercise discipline initiative and develop good judgment, they have to tolerate mistakes within acceptable limits during preparation and training. As the doctrine so wisely notes, judgment is built on experience, and experience often comes from bad judgment.
You have to give people room to make tolerable mistakes today so they gain the experience to avoid catastrophic failures tomorrow.
The moment subordinates fear reprisal for raising an issue or reporting bad news, communication shuts down. Shared understanding vanishes, and the commander is left operating from faulty, self-serving assumptions.
The entire organization becomes susceptible to those same biases we just discussed.
And to really crystallize these ideas, visualization, shared understanding, and the danger of a toxic command style, we need to look at command in action. We have two powerful historical contrasts here.
Let's start with a positive example.
Yeah.
Major General J. Lawton Collins and the 7th Corps during the Ruhr encirclement in 1945. The doctrine holds this up as a prime example of mutual trust-enabling initiative.
Collins and his staff had served together almost continuously since the D-Day landings. This created this profound familiarity and mutual trust. His command technique was incredibly efficient. He maintained shared understanding through constant collaboration and dialogue, and he minimized written guidance.
The anecdote here is stunning.
It is. During the entire European campaign, Collins issued only 20 formal field orders. That's an average of 2 per month.
20 orders for a whole campaign.
Yeah.
It's an unbelievable reliance on shared intent rather than detailed prescription. His command was based on making sure his subordinates knew the ultimate goal.
His focus was on visiting subordinate commanders, especially those leading the main effort, to discuss the big picture and confirm the higher commander's intent verbally. This clarity paid off dramatically during the final push to close the Ruhr pocket.
What happened there?
Collins was tasked with linking up with the 9th Army near Paderborn. His key unit was the 3rd Armored Division, commanded by Major General Maurice Rose. And on March 30th, Major General Rose was killed in action.
A massive leadership vacuum at the most critical moment.
Under a traditional, centralized command, this would have stopped the entire operation cold.
But because Collins had so effectively communicated his visualization and the overall intent, the subordinates knew the purpose of the operation, not just the task list.
Exactly. Their understanding was so clear that operations resumed the very next day, preventing the Germans from exploiting that lapse in leadership. Furthermore, Collins himself adapted. German resistance was heavy around the original link-up point, Paderborn.
So rather than stubbornly clinging to the initial anchor point, he updated his visualization to reflect the current reality.
He quickly contacted the 9th Army commander and proposed an alternative, Lippstadt, which was tactically superior given the situation. The link-up was achieved on April 1st, closing the pocket and trapping almost 350,000 German soldiers.
A decisive victory made possible by shared understanding.
Which enabled both the higher commander to adapt and the subordinates to continue with aggressive, disciplined initiative, even after losing their key leader.
That is the gold standard of command. Now let's pivot to a negative contrast, where that foundation of trust and shared purpose was completely absent. The command climate of Lieutenant General Edward Mallory Ullmann during the Korean War.
Ullmann commanded the X-Corps during critical operations like Incheon and the move into North Korea. Biographies paint a picture of a brilliant, courageous officer whose personal qualities completely undermined his capacity for effective command. He was known for being brash, dictatorial, arrogant, and impatient.
That sounds like a recipe for the total breakdown of psychological safety.
It was. Ullmann frequently clashed with his subordinate commanders, most famously Major General Oliver P. Smith of the 1st Marine Division, who was the exact opposite, methodical, cautious, and insistent on proper logistics and flank protection.
So what were the specific operational effects of that poor command climate?
Ullmann had a tendency to fragment his units, pushing them forward without enough reserves, without flank security, without proper logistical support. His subordinates often interpreted his brashness as a callous indifference to casualties and the welfare of his men. His directives essentially forced them into high-risk gambling situations rather than calculated, accepted risk.
So, when a commander operates like this, undermining their subordinates' professional judgment, creating this antagonistic climate, the whole structure of visualization and shared understanding just collapses.
The essential reciprocal nature of command is lost. Subordinates like Major General Smith were forced into a defensive posture, spending time and energy arguing with their superior about basic operational necessities instead of focusing on the enemy.
They couldn't rely on Mission Command's disciplined initiative.
Because they couldn't trust Ullmann to accept their adaptation. They were just trying to survive a hostile internal command structure. This contrast really shows that tactical brilliance or personal courage, which Ullmann had, are not enough if your personal qualities destroy mutual trust.
Command requires the art of people management as much as the art of war.
You cannot execute mission command and achieve that complex state of visualization and shared understanding without trust. Collins built it through collaboration. Ullmann destroyed it through antagonism, and the results in both cases were predictable.
So we've spent today traversing this whole landscape of command, starting with that difficult journey from raw data to synthesized understanding, which forms the foundation of the commander's mental blueprint. visualization.
And we learned that even when that mental blueprint is theoretically sound, it is constantly under threat by the human brain's predictable flaws, those insidious cognitive biases like anchoring, sunk cost, and the confirmation trap.
Which can turn highly intelligent people into irrational actors, as we saw so vividly with the Bay of Pigs.
The key takeaway for any leader is the imperative to proactively battle those biases through structured mitigation techniques, using red teams to challenge assumptions, promoting diversity of thought, and creating a safe climate where questions are valued over blind compliance.
Ultimately, effective command and control is a deeply reciprocal process. Commanders provide direction and purpose. Subordinates provide critical feedback and exercise disciplined initiative. The whole thing is built on a foundation of mutual trust.
And if that foundation is toxic, like in the Korean War example, the system fails, regardless of the tactical situation.
That contrast between the success of Collins, who delegated ruthlessly based on trust, and the failure of Almond, who micromanaged based on personal arrogance, brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener.
We saw how President Kennedy, after the catastrophic failure of the Bay of Pigs, dramatically improved his decision-making process for the Cuban Missile Crisis. He actively sought diverse counsel, he challenged his own assumptions, he structured dissent, he learned quickly.
The doctrine states clearly that sound judgment comes from experience, and experience often comes from bad judgment. This raises a critical question for you as a leader in your organization.
Are you structuring your training and non-critical operations to allow for tolerable, survivable mistakes? Mistakes that develop the very judgment required when the stakes are at their absolute highest.
Self-reflection on your own biases is the first step, but creating the organizational climate that allows others to fail forward is how you forge experience and ultimately save the mission.
So think about how you are training your teams today to learn from failure, because that failure may be the very lesson that saves your operation tomorrow.